Hi, Tom. Welcome to Haaretz UCLA conference. Is that the toughest period that you can recall in Israel from your experience?
Yeah, I would say so, Aluf, from many levels. One is the sheer number of casualties caused by the Hamas attack, the sheer number of casualties caused by the Israeli retaliation, and the fact that it's all happening in a global environment. You know, when the Ukraine war broke out, I said, this is actually World War One. Oh, that thing we called World War One, 1914 to 1918, wasn't really a world war. Half the world was colonized then. Half the world were subsistence farmers. The Ukraine war is the first true world war. Everyone could follow it on a smartphone. People could opine about it. Agricultural impacts were felt almost immediately because Ukraine and Russia were such big fertilizer exporters. So it was felt on food prices. It was a real world war. I argue that Israel-Gaza is actually World War II. This is the second.
In what sense?
In the sense that everyone in the world has an opinion about it, is following it, is affected by it, and it touches classrooms everywhere at every university, and every war now is almost becoming a war.
When we talk about Israel's global stance, first of all, the relationship with the United States. On one hand, we see unprecedented support, especially military support, diplomatic support, veto at the United Nations, arms shipments flowing into Israel. And at the same time, growing concern and growing criticism from the Biden administration, and much more so from the progressive parts of the Democratic Party. Are we going to diverge? Or is that both the best and the worst time in Israel-US alliance?
I mean, you could say that even more broadly for Israel, this is a moment of incredible opportunity and great peril. Because on the one hand, before the war started, you had Saudi Arabia reaching out, offering to normalize with Israel on condition Israel make progress with the Palestinians. And at the same time now, we've seen a collapse in support for Israel among a certain demographic and among a certain particular part of the Democratic Party spectrum. And so, look, this is very dangerous. I mean, if I look at the future right now, Aluf, I would say this to you, that Israel's either going to come out of this war with a new relationship with Palestinians in 2024, or we're going back to 1947, 48 with new weapons. So it's either going to be a new relationship in 2024 or back to the founding, war with new weapons, precision weapons. But 2023 is no longer available.
But what could Israel do to affect that? Just, by accepting the Biden idea, the Biden doctrine, the Biden plan for two-state solution, and adding the normalization with Saudi Arabia and maybe other Arab countries. Just by saying so, when the ruling government in Israel and the Prime Minister Netanyahu opposed that idea strongly. They said that this would be the end of Israel and defeat if the Palestinian state comes out of that war.
Look, I'll be honest. I mean, I think this is the worst government Israel's ever had. I think Bibi Netanyahu will go down as the worst leader in Jewish history, not just in Israeli history. I follow Israeli politics very closely my whole adult life. I know virtually nobody in this Israeli cabinet. I would not let this Israeli cabinet be waiters at my grandson's bar mitzvah. I think this is a group, save for a few people like Gallant and others, are truly incompetent. And what makes it so incompetent is that they launched a war to eliminate Hamas after October 7th for very legitimate security reasons, but without any plan for the morning after. And those of us who lived through 9/11 know what happens when you do that. And it wouldn't take much, but if Israel did have a plan to partner with the Palestinian Authority to work toward the long-term goal of two nation states for two people, it would solve three problems. Right now, Israel's losing on the narrative front. It has no narrative. about how the war should end. It's losing on the Gaza front. It has no plan for security in Gaza once Hamas is smashed, and we've seen that now in the food rioting. And it has no ability to generate the regional allies it needs to deal with the Iranian octopus that is squeezing Israel through its proxies of Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, and Islamic militias in Iraq. If Israel had a plan to work with the Palestinian Authority or transform Palestinian Authority toward two states for two nations, it would change the narrative, it would change the Gaza options, and it would vastly create cement a regional alliance so Israel's Arab allies and America's Arab allies could work together against Iran. Without that, Israel's just naked on all three fronts.
But what we see is the opposite. We see members of the cabinet and members of the coalition calling for the depopulation of Gaza from Palestinians, expelling them to the Sinai or to Europe or to elsewhere, and just building Jewish villages and towns in all those places that were demolished during the war in Gaza.
All I can say, is that's madness. It's not something that, let's forget Europe, the Middle East, the Muslim world and how it would react. That would produce a ferocious counter-reaction from the U.S. Congress, and I would say from Democrats and Republicans. It's a fantastic, absurd, and insane notion, but it reflects something. And because when I see it and I think about it, that you do have a generation, and you have a segment of Israel that I think has been living in a bubble, an ideological bubble, a religious nationalist bubble, and it's now in charge. And so the instincts that you and I might have, or just a sort of a moderate friend of Israel, I don't think they're in this group. I think they're all talking to themselves. And the fact that they are now in such an important leadership position makes me really worried for Israel's future.
Did you ever, even in your worst dream, thought that Israel would stand accused at the International Court of Justice of genocide?
I find that horrific. I think it's wrong. I don't think this is genocide. I do think it's a terrible war in which too many civilians were killed, but I don't believe it was deliberate. But it's a reflection of both where the left is globally right now, but also a reflection of the way Israel has launched a war without any political vision, and therefore leaving itself exposed to people who are truly hostile, ill-intentioned, but Israel's just served itself up on a golden platter.
Could the war affect the American presidential election?
Yechol liot. I mean, I doubt it, but it could. Obviously, it would come down to a state like Michigan, and if Muslim and Arab American voters in Michigan carry through with their threat to stay home or vote for Trump or either one, it could, in a close election, make a difference. I hope they don't do that. I hope they reflect on who Donald Trump is and what that would mean for Arab and Muslim Americans if he becomes president again. But there's definitely, in the left wing of the Democratic Party, just a great deal of questioning and hostility, even to Israel right now. And Israel has just made it too easy for people there this Israeli government, not to take seriously the threat of Hamas and Israel's predicament. But it's when you launch a war with no vision for the morning after, let alone the very simple vision of let's work toward two states for two nations, for two indigenous people, you leave yourself open to this, and I worry terribly. It's a friend of mine was joking to me the other day, if there were another Israel, I'd go live there. But there isn't. So this is the Jewish state that the Jewish people have, and it needs more responsible leadership, not a leader who is focused it seems to be entirely on his own political survival.
But there is a streak in the Israeli right wing that believes that, if Donald Trump returns to the White House, then Israel would be off the hook and would just get a carte blanche to do whatever it wants vis-a-vis the Palestinians and elsewhere. And all that government has to do is to wait out until the American election and then get a free hand.
Anyone who is betting on Donald Trump to do anything you expect him to do is a damn fool.
Do you fear that Israeli democracy would be or could be just another victim of that war? Following the judicial coup that Netanyahu was trying to promote before the war, and that some of his underlings are still promoting under the shadow and fog of the war, could Israeli democracy be a casualty here?
Well, let me start from 30,000 feet, Aluf. I really just write about three things these days: Trump, Ukraine, and Israel. Because I believe if Netanyahu survives this war, if Ukraine loses to Putin, and if Trump is reelected, the world I want to leave for my new grandchildren is just not going to be here. And so these are very, very important stories, as far as I'm concerned. As you know, because we've talked, I was singularly focused on fighting against the judicial coup that Netanyahu was mounting in the months before this war. But as you also may recall, the morning after the election that brought Bibi Netanyahu to power back in November of 2022, I wrote a column, the lead of which was "The Israel You Knew Is Over." And that was because I actually knew these people. I covered Kahana when I was the New York Times correspondent back in the 80s in Israel. And I tried to explain to my American Jewish friends, you didn't go to Camp Ramah with these people. They were not in the cabin in the Catskills next to you. You've never met these people. They just walked right out of the Second Temple. And if you don't take them seriously and understand that Israel, its fate, future, and character as a democracy and as a moderate Jewish state that can appeal to a broad spectrum of American and world Jewry, if you don't think that's up for grabs, you're not paying attention at all. And so I made that a huge focus of my column writing, and I'm proud to say that I got helped get President Biden to make two statements in opposition to the judicial reform, judicial coup that Netanyahu was promoting. So, which he did in my column, and I that fight is not over. These people are, Israel is to wider trends in politics what off-Broadway is to Broadway. And just as you have a trend within the Republican Party today that really believes that authoritarian government is the best thing for America right now, you have the exact same trend in Israel in miniature. And that's who these people are. And the only thing that can save Israel, the only thing that can save America, is if people turn out and vote these people out with the singular focus that isn't about taxes, it isn't about education policy, it isn't even about as an important issue as abortion. There's a deeper, broader issue. This is about the fate and future of democracy in Israel and in the United States. That's where we're at.
And how do you see the implications of the war on the Jews in the diaspora and in the United States in particular? I just read Franklin Foer's piece in The Atlantic about the end of the golden age for Jews in America. Do you feel that?
I'm very concerned. I think Frank made a very compelling point that we live in an age where both the far right and the far left are hostile to Israel. But I don't think it's irreparable. If there were a different Israeli government, a national unity government of the center left and center right, I think all of that is reversible with just one move, agreeing to engage in dialogue with Palestinians over a process to develop two nation states for two people. I think it's fixable, but I think if we don't go there will just be a steady erosion of the next generation coming up. I mean, I'm of a generation, I've had a huge amount of experience with Israel over many years. I've known a very different Israel before Benjamin Netanyahu. But there are a lot of 20-year-olds in America right now who the only Israel they know is the Israel of Bibi Netanyahu, an Israel of settlements, of impugning any hope for a Palestinian state. And that's not to any way excuse Palestinians for the huge missed opportunities that they've let go, for the very poor leadership and terrible decisions they've made. But it is a fact that there's a whole cottage industry now, Aluf, of people writing a two-state solution's a fantasy. It's a fantasy, never going to happen. What are you talking about? To which I say, oh, thank you for explaining that to me. I thought it was easy. Here I was just thought it was easy. Oh, thank you. I don't know how many trees have been cut down for these articles about a two-state solution is impossible. To which I have a very simple question in Hebrew. Asma. Asma, okay? So, I happen to think it's super difficult, but I happen to think the alternatives are all much, much worse, and that I have actually a lot of confidence in the Israeli people after this is over, that they will take in what has happened, and with the right leadership on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side and American side, I think a different discussion is possible.
Thanks, Tom, for a very candid appreciation of the situation in Israel, in the region, and the world. And on that half optimistic note about the opportunity that still might come out of this mess, I'd like to thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Great for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Welcome to this panel on the impact of October the 7th on Israel's international relations. I want to, first of all, introduce our panelists. First of all, Yael German, who was mayor of Herzliya and elected to the Knesset in 2013 for the Yesh Atid party. You served as Minister of Health, and then you were appointed as the Ambassador of Israel to France, but resigned in December 2022 in protest against what you called the extremism of Netanyahu's new far-right coalition and its anti-democratic legislative program. You actually said at that point, I cannot lie to myself and continue representing a policy that is so radically different from everything that I believe in. Absolutely. You then became a familiar speaker at protests against the government's judicial coup. Nimrod Goren is the president and founder of Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies, a foreign policy think tank aiming to improve Israel's foreign policy and regional integration and to advance Israeli-Palestinian peace. Ahmed Maher is senior political editor at Majalla, a Saudi-owned print and online magazine based in London, part of the Middle East's largest publishing groups. He was formerly a reporter at Al Jazeera English, The National, and the BBC. He often reports from Israel and the Palestinian territories. A couple of months ago, Ahmed was in the Knesset to interview opposition leader Yair Lapid, who told him that the two-state solution is not, in fact, dead. Alon Pinkas is a senior columnist for Haaretz. He served as chief of staff to two of Israel's ministers of foreign affairs. He was a foreign policy advisor for Ehud Barak and political advisor to Shimon Peres, and served as Consul General of Israel in New York. Now, we'll get on to our main subject. There has been a roller coaster in Israel's international relations since October the 7th. There were already tensions between Israel and liberal democracies in the West since Netanyahu and his far-right coalition was established. But in the West, especially amongst Israel's partners and allies, there was a wave of solidarity after the Hamas atrocities of October the 7th. President Biden's bear hug began with an unprecedented wartime visit just 11 days after the attack, and European allies followed suit. Israel's Arab allies have kept their criticisms on a relatively low boil. But as the scale of Israel's military response escalated, along with the death toll of Palestinians in Gaza, and now the very real fear of famine, the tide seems to be turning. That's most clearly expressed by how explicit Biden's critique now is, saying that Netanyahu is hurting Israel's interests more than helping them, and referencing potential red lines in the US-Israel relationship. To start off, I wanted to ask a quick fire round of all of you panelists, so to be as concise as you possibly can be. From where you stand, how deep is the crisis in Israel's international relations and international standing right now? Yael, would you like to start?
I know, thank you. Well, I would like to start by saying that after the 7th of October, which is marked on my skin and in my heart, we moved, every one of us moved maybe a little bit to the right. I'm not so sure that that's to the right, then rather we tend to be more patriotic. All the Israelis are very patriotic. We are very worried of what is going to happen in Israel. We are very worried of the war and of the kidnapped. And that's a change that happened in our society.
And what about in terms of international Israel's relationship with countries around the world? Is it in crisis right now?
Absolutely, it is in crisis. Not that it wasn't in crisis a long time ago. You know, the first thing that I heard, the first meeting that I had in Paris with a diplomat, I heard the two-state solution and nothing else. Only two-state solution, and there is no as an answer. There is no as an answer. So I don't think that the distribution between us and the other world and the Western world has changed. Only now it is more specific.
Okay, Alon, how deep is the crisis right now?
As the apex point of a process that leads Israel, that led and leads Israel to isolation. It is bordering on a pariah state in most of the world outside the United States of America. But in one sentence, it is reversible. It is not an immutable law of political nature. But in order for that to change and be reversed, there needs to be a radical political change inside Israel.
Nimrod?
All right.
Let me ask you, how deep is the crisis that Israel finds itself now in its international relations?
There is an upside and a downside. The upside is that even now, several months after the beginning of the war and the Hamas attack on October 7th, Israel's allies in the international community still support the basic war objectives that Israel spelled out. That regional cooperation or ties at least continue without being cut. But significantly are the downsides, which are evolving and becoming more significant. The way that Israel is being distanced by different actors in the international community, initially public opinion, but gradually, as we saw with Biden, by friendly leaders. And that reflects a change, a decrease in Israel's standing, its power, its branding, its ability to lead diplomatic processes. I agree with Alon, this is reversible, it's pending political change in Israel, not necessarily a radical one perhaps. As we saw when Benn came into office, it's sometimes enough to have a change in the prime minister position. It's very much seen as a personalized thing with Netanyahu in the international community. So a new prime minister will be able, I think, to fix some of the major issues that Israel is currently facing in the international arena.
And Ahmed, from where you stand, how deep is the crisis in Israel's international standing?
I think the criticism nowadays is coming as well from close allies to Israel, including in particular the United States and the United Kingdom. If we remember a few days ago, President Joe Biden said that Israel's conduct of the war is over the top. So this is very embarrassing and maybe alarming for Israel's standing in the eyes of the international community, and not just from in the eyes of those who are against Israel, but also from chief allies. In a nutshell, I mean, now also the worsening humanitarian crisis in Gaza Strip makes things worse for Israel. I mean, the more death toll climbs in Gaza, the more embarrassing and alarming the situation is for Israel in general.
Right, okay, we're going to dive now into the concentric circles of foreign relations emanating from Israel, if we can talk about it like this. We're going to start with the wider Middle East, then we're going to move to Europe, and then to the US. So, Nimrod, if you could give an idea of the spectrum of official Middle East responses to October the 7th and to the ongoing war in Gaza.
Generally speaking, we see a continuation of trends that began when the current coalition led by Netanyahu and including his far-right partners began to shape. So after the coalition was formed, there was a slowdown of relations with Israel's neighbors in the Arab world. There were less meetings between officials, there were less engagement in unilateral and multilateral regional mechanisms. There was a lot of threats coming towards Israel on possible provocations in statements, in actions and policies done especially by the far-right ministers. There was a lot of pushback against settlers' violence and their consequences. So a lot of that is kind of intensified and continued after October 7th. But still, the relation between Israel and the Arab world is proving to be resilient. The interest for the ties are still there. While every Arab country has been responding in a different manner, the very nature of the relationship kind of sticks. And it's worth taking a bit of a look at how the different countries responded. And we can look at the immediate neighbors with which Israel had peace treaties with, Egypt and Jordan. We can look at the Abraham Accord countries. And of course, we can look at countries that still do not have the ties with Israel. So Egypt and Jordan, in a nutshell, were very concerned. They were posing red lines, especially on the possible flow of refugees from Gaza, maybe from the West Bank, into their territories. The language used against it was very fierce, including threats of actual war, which we didn't hear for decades with those countries. But then again, the practical cooperation, whether on a bilateral level on natural gas and water, whether coordination on key issues relating to the war, hostage negotiation, pause, humanitarian aid, all of that enabled to continue despite the tensions. With the Gulf countries, we need to put attention on the UAE, which was actually the only Arab country that engaged officially with the Israeli leaders after October 7th. Initially, it was a phone call with President Herzog just as the Hamas attack happened, and then later it hosted President Herzog at the COP climate change summit in their territory. So there was a continuation in that. There was a commitment to continue normalization, but there was also statements about the warm peace may turn into a cold one, and regional stability that was so important for the Emiratis when going to the Abraham Accords was now put in jeopardy. Other countries like Morocco kept a lower profile. Bahrain even went forward and condemned Hamas. I think it was the only Arab country that clearly had a condemnation, a public condemnation of Hamas. This is the thing Israelis wanted to hear more from Arab countries with which we have good relationship. And it's also happening in different countries, like in Lebanon, where all of a sudden you see voices that are speaking about possible peace with Israel after a war, about opposition to escalation by Hezbollah on the border. Regional mechanism, regional network like the Negev Forum, like other prosperity projects with Jordan and the UAE in Israel on electricity and water, those were put on hold, but some of them did not convene also before the war because of the coalition position. So
can we just go on? I just wanted to add, you know, if you can add one sentence also about Turkey and their Erdogan's reiterated bear hug for Hamas.
Yeah, and remember the good meeting that Netanyahu and Erdogan had just in September on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, where they committed to mutual visits by the heads of state. That meeting is gone. You know, what we saw with Turkey is a total reversal of the tide. Very harsh statements coming from Erdogan, a lot of responses, rhetorical responses coming from Israel back, cutting some of the cooperation that did take place. But generally speaking, this is a pattern that unfortunately we saw in the past and is coming back. We need also to acknowledge the difference between what is being said in public and what is being said in closed rooms, especially with some of the Arab countries. When we engage with people from those countries, we hear different messaging than what are being voiced publicly. Generally, relations are resilient. Israel currently doesn't have diplomats in the capitals of those Arab countries. It evacuated the embassy because of security concerns. I think those diplomats should come back to their offices to try and help and manage these relationships as most as possible during these days of tension.
Okay. Ahmed, you wrote in Majalla, from my first-hand reporting in Israel, I've gotten the sense that the Israeli public actually is not aware of real Arab concerns. Now, there is obviously a problem in assessing public opinion accurately in states that are not entirely democratic, but I think we can still do better than just count how many Palestinian flags there are on the streets of Sana'a. Can you give some idea of where public sentiment is in the Arab world right now? And who are the main influences, or what is the main influence on their opinion, and how are they getting their information? And how wide, if I can add one more question, sorry, how wide is the gap between grassroots opinion and state policy?
The gap is huge. And I will start with Egypt, which is the most populous country in the Arab world, and it's a very heavyweight country, of course, and it's an immediate neighbor to the Gaza Strip and Israel. So if we start with Egypt, for an example, there is a huge gulf between the state policy and the public sentiment. But you can't gauge the public sentiments at the moment because simply the protests and the demonstrations are banned in Egypt, except for scattered protests every now and then. In the very beginning, after the Hamas attacks and the Israeli response, or the declaration of war by Israel in response to the Hamas attacks, in Egypt, there was some protests, but after these protests, the demonstrations were banned. So you can't tell the public sentiments from the streets, but you can gauge the sentiments and the reaction on social media, like Twitter, like Facebook, which is very popular in Egypt, and TikTok. The thing is, what I get from these reactions on social media from Egyptians from all walks of life and perhaps different age groups, that what is really annoying and irritating for most of them is the daily images coming from Gaza, the killing of children, women, men, civilians. Not Hamas, and this is very important to make. I couldn't get a general view to my way of thinking that Hamas is that popular. So they are not angry because of Hamas. They are angry because of the worsening humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip.
Right. Now, just want to ask another question to both you and to Nimrod. There was a rising tide of interest in normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia before October the 7th. Immediately afterwards, it seemed like that was a dream for another generation. But the noise is coming back again now in the framework of a possible way to rehabilitate Gaza after the war, that there would be some element of Israeli-Saudi normalization along with Saudi funding for Gaza's rebuilding. How far is this normalization talk realistic? And for the Saudis, how far is Israel the problem or Netanyahu? Nimrod, do you want to just answer first?
Thank you. Yes, there was a lot of progress on Israel-Saudi relations before the war, and it was a continuation of almost a decade of gradual opening by the Saudis towards Israel as part of a new vision for the kingdom. I think it was 10 years ago exactly in an Haaretz peace conference at the time of the previous round of war in Gaza, in which there was maybe the first public engagement with a Saudi figure with the Israeli public. And since then we saw many of those things happening time and time again. Currently there is a component of what the Saudis will get from the American side for normalization, and there is a component of what they will get on the Palestinian issue from Israel. And before the American election, seemingly there is an interest to explore what the Biden administration can give the Saudis in terms of the defense pact that has been discussed. And that leads to some ambiguity on the Saudi position on what are the actual conditions from Israel for a normalization. Because in the past, we remember the Arab Peace Initiative, there was a clear linkage between the establishment of a Palestinian state as a condition for normalization. And recently we saw that linkage kind of become blurred with all kind of confusing messaging on whether it's a pathway to a state or irreversible steps, or maybe only recognition by external powers of a Palestinian state and not an issue that Israel should do. So I think for the Israeli peace camp that used to play the Saudi normalization card as a major incentive to move forward for peace with the Palestinians, now it's unclear exactly what the Saudi position is and how much the Saudi Palestinian issue is a real condition and merely not a kind of face-saving or symbolic necessity to legitimize a normalization process that will serve other Saudi interests.
So Maher, can you give, Ahmed, can you give me some, give us some idea about how live this talk about normalization really is now in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, the main metric here, Esther, is the official statements from the Saudi officials, which is, it's all depending on to recognize Israel and to normalize ties with Israel. It's all depending on the recognition of an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with East Jerusalem as its capital. This is the official stance, and this is the Saudi, the main, if not the only Saudi metric, to be honest.
And so the war in Gaza hasn't really shifted things one way or another. It's the interest is still the same if those conditions are met.
I mean, yes. I mean, if these conditions are met, the window for normalization is open, according to the Saudi officials, chiefly the Saudi foreign minister. But let's be clear about something very important when it comes, and to my way of thinking, when it comes to the Abraham Accords between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, and Bahrain. These accords were not conditional. I mean, there were no conditions from the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco to normalize ties with Israel. It was a major foreign policy achievement by the Trump administration at the time and Jared Kushner. So the thing is, what I want to say, these countries had demands and had their own I would say demands, not conditions, from the United States and not from Israel. So they were kind of keen on their ties with the United States, more than just normalizing ties with Israel. For instance, Morocco wanted to secure the Western Sahara problem. Sudan wanted to be crossed off the state sponsor of terrorism, the list drawn by the United States. And the United Arab Emirates, as far as I remember, asked for F-35 fighters, jet fighters. But when it comes to Saudi Arabia, I mean, there is one clear condition to recognize Israel and to normalize ties with Israel is the recognition of an independent Palestinian state.
Okay, thank you. Right, we're going to move to you, Yael, because we're going to move to Europe. Can you give an overview of where Europe now stands in terms of its relations with Israel?
Yes, absolutely. But with your permission, I would like to remark something about the Abraham Accord.
Okay.
You're asking about the Abraham Accord, and they are really one of the most important moves that was diplomatic moves at the last years. And I do believe that the future and whether they will exist and will flourish or will disappear depends on the end of this war. If we'll end this war as winners, then there will be no problem to go on with another states, with Arab Saudi, with Kuwait, with many other countries, because the Arab countries are looking at what we are doing, and they know that the end of this war and the way that we are going to end this war is very crucial to their future. So I do believe that there is a great hope that we'll have other accords, other Abraham Accords, but it depends on the end of this war. This is about Abraham Accord. Now about the what happens in Europe. President Macron said fewer times that the anti-Zionism hides under the anti-Semitism. Le anti-Zionisme se cache derrière le anti-Semitisme. And he's so right. And that's what we are saying now in Europe. The anti-Semitism is rising up, and you hardly can differentiate between the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism. It is mixed together. So when you are looking at Europe, you understand that we have a lot to do on the matter of explanation and talking and explain really what happened. I really feel, I couldn't hear very well, but I heard Ahmed that he said that we don't understand what is happening in the Arab world. I'm sure that he's absolutely right. But I can say that we feel that nobody in the world, especially the Arab world, but not only, really understand what is happening with us, what a terrible trauma we have passed at the 7th of October, and how we are hurt and sad and mourning, and how it inflicted on our opinion and our willing to go on and have peace talks.
Now,
I totally agree.
Sorry, go on.
I totally agree. Yes, I totally agree also. I mean, it's not just one way. It's a two-way process. The Arabs do not understand the trauma of the Israelis and what happened of the horrible attacks on October the 7th. And the Israelis do not understand the public sentiments in the Arab world, not just after October the 7th, but even October the 6th before October the 7th. So it's a two-way process and two traumas actually.
I do agree, and that's why we have to talk.
That's what we're here for.
Yes.
In the last few years, Netanyahu has consistently invested time and effort in cultivating ties with the hard right in Europe. Do you think that that has borne any diplomatic fruit since October the 7th? Is there any way of differentiating European responses to October the 7th and the Gaza war, depending on where Netanyahu has spent his diplomatic efforts?
Absolutely, yes, but not only this. I find Netanyahu to be absolutely guilty of what happened at the 7th of October. He nourished the Hamas. He gave them money. He thought that by supporting the Hamas, he will undermine the Fatah and the Palestinians. And that was one of his biggest mistakes. And the conception that we are talking about is from his way of thinking and from his school. It's the school of Netanyahu. And I find him to be guilty of all that happened at the 7th October and since 7 October. And in my opinion, he should get out and should resign.
Okay, well, that's straight and clear. Alon, you wrote recently that Netanyahu had managed to break the unbreakable alliance with the United States. Is the rising tone between Israel and the US about the conduct of the war in Gaza caused by what some people have called Israel's ingratitude towards its most essential ally? Or did Biden actually give Netanyahu too much support too quickly?
I don't think that even Joe Biden thought that Netanyahu was capable of such levels of ingratitude, incompetence, and total derision and dismissal of the importance of relations between the states, because everything he's been doing since 6:29 a.m. on Saturday, October 7th, is about his political survival. Everything else be damned. I don't think there was too much support. I think that the president did condition some of the support. But Mr. Netanyahu took it for granted and ignored a lot of America's requests. So in that respect, Mr. Netanyahu did break the so-called unbreakable alliance. But one more sentence. This hasn't begun on October 7th. Far from it. Mr. Netanyahu's meddling in American politics goes back 15 years, perhaps more, to his first term from 96 to 99. But to keep it contemporary and current, for the year preceding October 7th, he was a persona non grata in Washington because of his constitutional coup d'etat. He was not invited. He was not taken seriously. Now, after October 7th, many people, not Joe Biden yet, but many people are beginning to ask a legitimate question. What exactly is Israel's strategic value to the US? Is it really just about Netanyahu, or is it something more structural? Can it be reversed if there's a new prime minister, whether his name is X, Y, or Z? Or conversely, is it something much deeper than that there are demographic changes and political changes in both countries that sort of encroach on the so-called unbreakable?
Now, some people have also said that not only has the war exposed ingratitude, if you want to call it that way, or strategic confusion on Israel's part, but has also exposed some degree of US weakness as well because of its inability to really leverage its influence over Israel, but also in general. So what is your take on that, and what could it mean in terms of any future confrontation with Iran?
That's a very big question. Strategically, it's the most important question that Israel will be facing, and here's why, and I'll try to keep it concise. The U.S., until October 6th, the U.S. was in the process of disengagement from the Middle East. For a variety of reasons, I'll just name 4 of them in bullet points. The disintegration of the Soviet Union, energy independence, which means that the U.S. no longer relies on Arab oil, fatigue and disillusionment with long wars, forever wars, as Biden called it, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and 4th, and most importantly, a reprioritization of American grand strategy towards the Indo-Pacific and China. Enter October 7th, and the U.S. was sort of pulled back into this quagmire. But the reasons, the fundamental reasons that caused America to disengage from the Middle East, Esther, remain the same even though October 7th happened, which means that many Americans in the foreign policy establishment see a divergence of interests between Israel and the U.S. You can recall how Mr. Netanyahu was against the nuclear deal with Iran, how he tried to undermine American policy. The vice president at the time was Joe Biden. You also recall how he tried to persuade, with some success, Mr. Trump to unilaterally withdraw from that agreement in May of 2018. So under Mr. Netanyahu's watch, Iran has gained an unprecedented amount of enriched uranium, the most advanced centrifuges it ever had, and many of its military nuclear installations are beyond reproach right now, according to the CIA, not according to yours truly. So yeah, if you know, this goes back to the beginning, to the very beginning of the Obama administration, when Mr. Netanyahu came to see newly elected President Obama. They were both newly elected at the time. In early 2009, Obama said to him, freeze the settlement building so we can together deal with the Iranian issue. Netanyahu did neither. He did not freeze. He did freeze for a few months. But then when Mr. Biden came to visit as vice president in October 2010, famously announced that they are being expanded yet again. And then, as he always does on brand, accused some mid-level guy from the Ministry of the Interior for putting on the tandems. So what in conclusion, what we're seeing since October 7th is a level of distrust and credibility gap that Mr. Netanyahu, credibility deficit that Mr. Netanyahu has in Washington, to the point that if these two gentlemen continue on dealing with the issue of Iran, I fail to see where they can agree.
Well, that's a jolly prediction.
I have better.
I'm sure you do, but we're about to, if we're going to head into predictive territory, we're about to go into the heart of the 2024 presidential elections. So how much time is there actually left for the US to leverage its influence in terms of how it wants the Gaza war to end and what's going to happen afterwards? And what do you think will be the front lines in the policy battles between Biden and Trump on Israel?
Well, I'll make this as quick as possible. I'd like to think that we will have an election in Israel before an American presidential election, i.e. before November, way before November 2024.
When? When is it possible?
I'll tell you after.
Okay.
I can't tell you now because people will go to Las Vegas and start making bets.
I'm thrilled.
But before November, anywhere between June and September, but just a rough guess. But per your question, Biden has about 2 or 3 months in order to salvage the acrimony that was built not just amongst Palestinian or Arab Americans in Dearborn, Michigan, that everyone rolls off their tongue. But he has a problem because of Gaza with the African American community, and he has a much broader problem with younger voters aged 18 to 40 who happen not to be necessarily African American or not to be of Palestinian or any other Arab origin. So he has no more than 2, maybe 3 months. Then we go deep into campaigning, and I don't think that's going to take too much of his time.
I noticed that Trump recently reiterated his claim that if he'd been president, then October the 7th wouldn't have happened, and just as Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine.
Nor would Pearl Harbor happen, nor would Nazi Germany. Sure.
But what kind of policy debate would there be between Biden and Trump on Israel?
I can't believe there's going to be a debate because Joe Biden is so much more experienced than Trump is. And there's nothing that Trump could attack Biden on in terms of his pro-Israel bona fides and his unlimited, some would say imbalanced, support of Israel. So it would be, if in the next month or so, Esther, the U.S. sort of exerts enough pressure that forces a ceasefire, then in a presidential debate somewhere in September or October, Mr. Trump could reiterate Mr. Netanyahu's whining that I was this close to winning, but he made me stop. That is the only thing I could see happening. Okay,
now I've got a final round for all of you, and it's a two-headed question. The first is, how bad could it still get for Israel's international relations if you have the whole span between potentially pressure on arms sales to Israel all the way to individual criminal cases at the ICC, or as Alon jumped the shark earlier to say, global pariah status? So the first question is, how bad could it get? And the second question is, what will Israel's post-war relations with the world look like? Which has some potential for a slightly more positive answer, if you so desire. Nimrod, do you want to jump in first? So how bad could it get? And what could Israel's post-war relations look like?
Yes, but with your permission, I will talk about how good can it get, because I think that's our responsibility now of those aspiring for peace, for democracy, for liberal values, to try and chart a positive path forward in these bleak days. And I think what was noted by Alon about the possibility of elections in Israel is a very important thing, because one of the positive aspects that we see is an understanding within the Israeli society that the current leadership has failed and does not deliver, and there is a yearning in the Israeli public from left to right, almost across the board, for a new prime minister. Again, not necessarily a pro-peace prime minister, but someone who will be more moderate. And I think that leadership change, whenever it's happening, will kind of change the tide in terms of the Israeli position in the international arena, especially when it's coupled with what we see as more effective international engagement on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, international efforts to put a diplomatic horizon for a two-state solution, international efforts for a new mechanism or new groupings that will engage with promoting peace, incentives for peace that are now pushed forward by the EU's Peace Day effort with Saudi involvement and others, and an understanding that you need to link regional cooperation between Israel and its neighbors and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. That wasn't linked before, and hopefully also with a reviving of Israeli-Palestinian interaction between civil societies. So if all of that falls into place, I think we are headed for a better reality, and this crisis, which is a very deep one, can eventually turn into a game changer for a more positive future for Israel, for the Palestinians, and for the region.
Yael, what is your prediction for how Israel's post-war relations with the world, how will they look?
Well, I would like to repeat what I've just said about the Arab world. I think that the Arab world, US and the EU, needs Israel to win. They all, just as they need the Hamas to be distinguished, not to be able to harm anymore neither us nor the world. And if we'll be able to do it, then there is a light there is a ray of hope in the future, which I believe that will be better than today. But if they won't let us do what we have to do in order to win, then there will be a disaster for us and for the world.
Ahmed, what's your take on how Israel's post-war relations with the world will look like?
I think it depends on, as far as the Arab world is concerned, it depends on the political aims and goals of Israel. The incumbent government, I'm not talking about the war cabinet, I'm talking about the coalition led by Netanyahu and far-right leaders like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. It seems to me that they want to prevent a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu himself said that, I remember, a few weeks ago, he said that he was the only, and I quote, the only one who was capable of preventing a Palestinian state. So it depends on the political. I always analyze the scene from a political perspective, as of course from an economic perspective as well, but politics says it all at the end of the day. So let's wait and remain and see whether if Israel has, and I totally agree, it might have an early elections, and Israel has a new government, a new leadership who believes in a two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside Israel. It might change the whole narrative in the Arab world.
Thank you. So, Alon, you get the final word.
I'll say it.
You can either go for both how bad could it get or how good could it look, or whichever combination you prefer.
Okay, first of all, I don't know how the war is going to end.
Or when.
Per Yael's remark before about winning, losing, or stalemate. It's very simple. It's a very simple equation. Relations with the world would be and can be and should be significantly improved if Netanyahu is not the prime minister, and will exponentially get worse if he is.
Thank you for that. Very concise. Well, thank you for all of our panelists, and thank you for watching.